Sarah Marshall pulled into her driveway in rural Montana after a long shift at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The late October air carried the crisp promise of an early winter as she stepped out of her truck. Her husband, Mike, was supposed to be back from his forestry assignment, and she looked forward to a quiet evening together. They had moved to this isolated property at the edge of national forest land 3 years ago, a dream for both wildlife enthusiasts. "Mike?" she called, pushing open the front door. No answer. Sarah found a hastily scrawled note on the kitchen counter. "Found something. In the shed. Come quick." The wooden shed sat 50 yards from their main house, originally built as a workshop, but now serving as Mike's makeshift veterinary station for occasional wildlife emergencies. As the regional forestry technician, he sometimes encountered injured animals that needed immediate care before transport to Sarah's rehabilitation center. Sarah hurried across the yard, her breath visible in the cooling evening air. She heard Mike's low, soothing voice before she reached the door. "Hey," he whispered when she entered. "Look what I found near Thompson Creek." In a large wire cage lined with blankets lay what appeared to be a bobcat kitten, no more than 4 months old by Sarah's estimation. Its spotted fur was matted with mud, one ear slightly torn, its wild yellow eyes darting frantically between the humans. "Mike, what were you thinking?" Sarah whispered, careful not to further agitate the animal. "You know we can't just—" "I know the protocol," Mike interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. "But I found it half submerged in the creek bed, hypothermic, no mother in sight for hours, another night out there, and it wouldn't have made it." Sarah knelt to examine the kitten more closely. Despite its fierce appearance, she could see it was severely underweight, with a slight tremor indicating possible neurological issues or simple exhaustion. "We should call Fish and Wildlife," she said, already knowing what Mike would say. "I did. Hayes is out until Monday, and the nearest rescue that can take a bobcat is in Missoula. Closed for the weekend. It's just 3 nights, Sarah. Then we can transfer it properly." Sarah sighed. As a wildlife rehabilitator, she understood the strict regulations against keeping native predators, especially without proper permits. But she also recognized a desperate situation when she saw one. 3 days, she agreed reluctantly. "Then it goes to Missoula, no matter what, and we keep this quiet. The last thing we need is trouble with the department." They created a temporary enclosure in their mudroom, a space they could close off from the rest of the house while providing the warmth the kitten desperately needed. Mike had already administered basic fluids, and the animal seemed to be stabilizing. "We should name it," Mike suggested as they watched the bobcat kitten cautiously explore its new confined space. "Absolutely not," Sarah replied firmly. "No naming, that's rule number 1 in rehabilitation. This isn't a pet, Mike. It's a wild predator that we're helping temporarily. They called it Kit anyway, just a designation," Sarah insisted, "not a name." That first night they took turns checking on the bobcat kitten. By morning it had consumed the raw meat they'd left and seemed more alert, though still wary. Its eyes tracked their movements with the calculating precision of a natural hunter. "The neurological symptoms seem better," Mike observed on the second morning, watching the kitten move with increasing coordination. "I think it was mostly hypothermia and exhaustion." Sarah nodded, relieved, but concerned about what would happen next. If it recovers this quickly, keeping it contained might become a problem. By Sunday evening, their 3rd day with the bobcat, an unexpected snowstorm hit the region. Roads to Missoula were temporarily closed, and Hayes from Fish and Wildlife called to say he couldn't make it out to their property until the weather cleared. "Just a few more days," Mike told Sarah, trying to hide his pleasure at the extension. She pretended not to notice how he'd upgraded the bobcat's enclosure, adding branches for climbing and various textures to stimulate its natural instincts. She also pretended not to notice how the fierce little predator seemed to recognize Mike's footsteps, its ears perking up whenever he entered the room. What Sarah couldn't ignore, however, was how quickly the kitten was regaining its strength, and how the temporary arrangement was beginning to feel less temporary by the day. 2 weeks later, the bobcat, which they were still calling Kit, despite Sarah's half-hearted protests, had transformed. The roads had cleared days ago, but Hayes from Fish and Wildlife had called with unexpected news. The Missoula Rehabilitation Center was dealing with a respiratory infection outbreak and couldn't accept new predators until it was resolved. Given your qualifications, Hayes had told Sarah over the phone, and the fact that you've already been caring for it, we can issue a temporary rehabilitation permit just until Missoula reopens. The permit arrived the next day, along with strict guidelines for minimal human contact and proper enrichment to ensure the Bobcat wouldn't imprint or habituate. Sarah posted the permit prominently on their refrigerator, a reminder of the professional boundaries they needed to maintain. But Kit was proving to be an unusual case. "I've never seen anything like it," Sarah admitted one evening, watching the Bobcat methodically dismantle an enrichment puzzle they'd constructed to stimulate its hunting instincts. The rate of recovery is remarkable. The Bobcat had nearly doubled in weight, its coat now glossy, and its movements fluid and precise. They had moved its enclosure to their enclosed porch, providing more space and exposure to natural light and sounds while keeping it secure. Mike, who had been documenting the rehabilitation process for their records, showed Sarah his observations. "Look at this problem-solving behavior. It's not just instinctual. There's genuine cognition happening." They maintained strict protocols, always wearing the same clothes when feeding, minimizing direct eye contact, using feeding tools rather than hands, and keeping conversation to a minimum when near the enclosure. Everything by the book to ensure Kit could eventually return to the wild. Then came the night that changed everything. A severe winter storm had knocked out their power. The temperature in the house was dropping rapidly, and the enclosed porch where Kit was kept became dangerously cold. After consulting the emergency protocols in their permit, they made the difficult decision to temporarily move the Bobcat's enclosure into their living room, near the wood stove. "Just until the power comes back," Sarah emphasized, helping Mike carefully relocate the cage. "And we'll minimize all interaction." They set up the enclosure and retreated to the kitchen, leaving the Bobcat to adjust to its new surroundings. When they returned an hour later to check, they found Kit sitting calmly, watching the flames dance in the wood stove with an almost meditative focus. That night, they slept on the sofa to maintain the fire and keep an eye on their wild charge. Sarah woke around 3 a.m. to an unusual sound, a rumbling vibration that momentarily confused her still drowsy mind. She carefully sat up, not wanting to disturb Mike, who was asleep at the other end of the sofa. In the dim glow of the wood stove, she saw that the door to Kit's enclosure was open. Her heart raced as she frantically scanned the room. Had the Bobcat escaped? Were they now sharing their home with an unrestrained predator? The rumbling sound came again, and Sarah slowly turned her head toward its source. There, impossibly, Kit was curled on the armchair adjacent to the sofa, eyes half closed, emitting what could only be described as a purr. Sarah froze, afraid. Any movement might provoke an attack. She whispered Mike's name until he stirred. "Don't move," she breathed. "The cage is open. Kit is out." Mike's eyes flew open, but when he saw the Bobcat lounging peacefully on the armchair, his expression shifted from alarm to wonder. "How did it get out?" he whispered. "I don't know, but we need to get it back in the enclosure without anyone getting hurt." They watched in astonishment as Kit stretched, jumped gracefully to the floor and padded around the living room, investigating every corner with cautious curiosity. The Bobcat moved with the confidence of a creature completely at ease in its surroundings, showing none of the fear or aggression they would expect from a wild animal in a strange environment. After completing its inspection, Kit approached the sofa. Sarah and Mike remained perfectly still as the Bobcat sniffed their feet. Then, in a movement that left them both speechless, jumped onto the couch and settled in the space between them. "This isn't normal behavior," Sarah whispered, her professional training battling with the extraordinary scene unfolding before her. Wild bobcats don't do this, yet there it was, a supposedly feral predator, curled up on their sofa like a house pet, the rumbling purr resuming as it closed its eyes. By morning, they had managed to coax Kit back into its enclosure with food. The power returned, and they moved the cage back to the enclosed porch, agreeing they needed to reinforce the latch and be more careful. Neither of them mentioned how. For those few hours in the night, the line between wild and domestic had blurred beyond recognition. The temporary rehabilitation permit had been extended twice. Winter had given way to spring, and Kit had grown into a magnificent subadult bobcat. The folks at Fish and Wildlife had become increasingly interested in their unusual charge, with Hayes making regular visits to observe and document. "I've been in this field for 20 years, Hayes admitted during his latest visit, watching Kit demonstrate remarkable problem-solving skills with an enrichment device, and I've never seen a bobcat behave quite like this one. What Hayes didn't see were the nights when Kit would somehow manage to escape its increasingly sophisticated enclosure, always when the house was quiet, always returning to its cage by morning. These nocturnal visitations had become a secret routine, one that Sarah and Mike discussed only in whispers, aware of how unorthodox their situation had become. On these nights, Kit would explore the house with careful precision, sometimes settling on the sofa beside them as they read, other times perching on the windowsill to watch the forest beyond. There was never any destruction, never any aggression, just the quiet companionship of a wild creature that seemed to exist in the liminal space between wilderness and domesticity. "We need to make a decision," Sarah said one evening in late April. The Missoula Wildlife Center had reopened months ago, and their extended permit was approaching its final deadline. "Kit needs to be released or transferred soon. The longer we wait, the harder it will be." Mike nodded, his expression conflicted. "I know, but I'm concerned about release. Kit has never learned to hunt live prey, and the level of comfort around humans, even if it's just us, could be dangerous, both for Kit and for people." They had carefully followed all protocols for minimal imprinting, yet the bobcat had developed an attachment that defied explanation. It maintained its wild instincts in most respects, startling at unexpected noises, marking territory, displaying natural bobcat behaviors, while simultaneously demonstrating an inexplicable comfort with their presence. "I've been researching options," Sarah said, unfolding a printout she'd been keeping in her work bag. "There's a wildlife sanctuary in Wyoming that specializes in predators that can't be released. They have a bobcat enclosure that spans nearly 2 acres of natural habitat." Mike studied the information. "They'd have a good life there, as good as possible for a bobcat that can't go truly wild. The best alternative, according to everyone I've consulted. And we could visit, check on progress." The decision was made. Sarah submitted the transfer application, and Hayes helped expedite the approval process. In 2 weeks, Kit would be transported to the sanctuary where it could live out its life in a protected natural environment. Those final days took on a bittersweet quality. They began leaving the enclosure door open at night, knowing Kit would return by morning, a small liberty they could grant before the bobcat's final journey. On the last night, they sat on the porch steps watching the sunset. Kit had emerged from the enclosure and was perched nearby, its attention divided between the forest sounds and its human companions. "Do you think it knows?" Mike asked quietly. "That everything is about to change?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't think so, but I also never thought a wild bobcat would choose to sit with us when it could be anywhere else." As darkness fell, Kit surprised them one final time. The bobcat approached slowly, deliberately, and settled between them on the step. For nearly an hour, they remained like this, 2 humans and a wild predator, sharing a moment of connection that transcended the natural order. In the morning, they secured Kit in the special transport carrier. Hayes arrived with the sanctuary representative, paperwork was signed, and just like that, the bobcat that had jumped on their couch like a house pet was gone. 6 months later, they received an update from the sanctuary. Kit had adapted well to the spacious enclosure, establishing territory and displaying healthy behaviors. The handlers had noted one peculiarity, however. Unlike the other bobcats that avoided human observation areas, Kit could often be found lounging in full view of the visitor platform, seemingly at ease with being watched. "Some animals just defy categorization," the sanctuary director had written. "Not quite wild, not quite tame, but something uniquely in between." Sarah pinned the update letter on their refrigerator, right where the temporary rehabilitation permit had once hung. Outside their window, the Montana wilderness continued its eternal cycles, wild and untamed. But within their home remained the indelible memory of those winter nights, when the boundary between wild and domestic had dissolved, leaving behind a story they would carry with them always, The bobcat that had, for a brief and magical time, jumped on their couch like a house pet.